Mr. Commissioner, we have a new group of witnesses to start a panel dealing with run size assessment, and this particular panel will be dealing with hydroacoustics. We have with us Mr. Mike Lapointe from the Salmon Commission, who has been sworn into these proceedings already, and Mr. Dr. Riddell from the Pacific Salmon Foundation, who's also been a witness already in the hearings. And perhaps you can just be reminded of their oath.
Yes, gentlemen, you're still.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, my questions will be, I'll try to direct them to the specific person who I'm asking them of, and my questions to begin with, for the most part, are directed to Mr. Lapointe. Currently, there are two in-river hydroacoustic programs operating in the Fraser, one at Mission and one at Quaylark. Is that right?
That's correct.
And Quaylark is just downstream from Yale, about 95 kilometers from Mission.
I think that's about right. It's about a 3-day swim. Brian and I were just sort of remarking on whether it might be a little bit shorter distance, but it's about 3 days swim for a fish anyway.
Okay. Are both of these hydroacoustic sites components of the in-season assessment program?
Not in a formal sense. The Quaylark program has been an experimental program. We did actually use Quaylark, although it was not planned in 2010. It wasn't planned preseason, but in general sense, they'd just been conducted as a bit of an experimental program.
Right, and I'd just like to do a couple of clarifications in the policy and practice report as we go through. The first one is policy and practice report number 5 at page 72. You'll see paragraph 84. The statement is, there are two in-river hydroacoustic programs currently used to assess the abundance of migrating Fraser River sockeye in season, one at Mission and one at Quaylark. I take it only the Mission one is officially used, although Quaylark is, in fact, it also does measure in-season abundance.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, the data that is collected at Quaylark, is it used in any way by the Fraser River panel to manage the Fraser River sockeye?
As I said, in 2008, 2009, so the Quaylark program's been operating for the last 3 years. It was used in an informal sense, so there was regular in-season exchanges of that information within a fairly small group, and it was used sort of informally. And in 2010, we did actually use the Quaylark estimates to actually adjust the Mission estimates. So informally, and then in 2010, that's the nature of how it's been used up until this point.
Okay. Is it expected that Quaylark will become part of the official in-river run size assessment program?
It's possible. Right now, the future of continued operation at Quaylark is in doubt.
And why is that? What's the concern?
It's mainly a funding issue. We're looking for alternative ways to fund the program, and there is actually a proposal that's being written as we speak, actually, to look at an alternate funding source, and we expect to hear probably sometime in February about the success of that particular proposal.
Right now, who funds the work at Quaylark?
Primarily DFO.
If this additional cost was added to the Salmon Commission, the Pacific Salmon Commission's budget, how would that work? What would be the impact?
It wouldn't fit too well in the current funding climate. The approximate cost of Quaylark, as we've been informed by our colleagues, is about $300,000 a year as an annual operating cost. That doesn't include things like capital and equipment that are associated with the program, but that would represent about 7% of our annual Secretariat budget, which is about $4 million, which is not a huge fraction of the total budget. But if you look at the fisheries management side of our budget, which is about $1 million of that $4 million, it's about a 30% of that budget. So the current climate, and I'm not trying to be negative about this, is just that the countries are quite conscious about keeping their contributions constant. Both the United States and Canada both kick in 50% of the total budget. So if it's a $4 million budget, each would contribute $2 million. And so any increments above that, quite legitimately are, looked at very carefully. And so it would be hard to push, in this case, approximately $150,000 per country easily through the budget process that we're going through right now.
Just another point in the PPR. I'll take you to in a minute. First of all, the Mission system, is that a split beam system?
Currently at Mission, we're operating primarily split beam transducers. We do have a Didson as well, but the primary estimation is by split beam. That's correct.
Okay. And at paragraph 187 on the page you see on your screen, the PPR says that the split beam system can measure the speed and direction of fish moving upstream and or downstream. It can also detect fish near the surface. Is that correct?
The first part of that sentence is absolutely fine. The second part of the sentence is kind of a yes and no answer, and I'll try to explain. Any hydroacoustic piece of equipment has a blind zone associated with objects that are very, very close to the front of the equipment. So it doesn't matter whether it's split beam or single beam or whatever the technology is. The Didson is not quite as susceptible to this as the split beam is. So we have two kinds of programs at the Mission site. One of them is a vessel where the equipment is looking downward into the water. And in that case, clearly fish near the surface would not be detected within about the first meter or so. Now, the shore-based system is a system that looks out from the shore into the middle of the river, and that one is operated on a number of different aims, if you like. So you can picture a piece of equipment that's sort of fanning through the water column like this with a certain number of minutes at each aim. So obviously, when it's aimed towards the surface, if the fish are far enough away, it can detect those fish on the surface. So it's a little bit complicated to suggest a rewording, but that's how I'd characterize the situation there.
Okay, thanks. And one last correction in the PPR I just want to get out of the way. Page 74, paragraph 193, references sort of 4 lines down. For Mission, there's a gillnet fishery downriver at Wannock that provides information on species composition, test fishing at the Mission site itself, and visual counts upstream at Hell's Gate. Is there also an additional test fishing site downstream of Mission that wasn't listed here? Yes,
it's called the Cottonwood site, and it's near the Dees Island Tunnel that you go through, the Highway 99 tunnel.
And what is that?
It's primarily for stock composition.
Thank you.
So the species composition being sockeye, pink, chinook, coho, stock composition being the individual components within the sockeye.
Okay, thank you. I think those are our points I wanted to raise in the PPR. So now I'd like to move to the Mission hydroacoustic site. First of all, the Mission hydroacoustic data is important for in-season run size estimation. Is that right?
It's probably the single most important part of the in-season run size estimation.
Okay. And the estimate of daily upstream migration collected at Mission is what we have heard many times referred to as the Mission escapement?
That's correct.
Okay. And how does that data that's collected at Mission get used in run size estimates?
Perhaps maybe I suggest a picture might be used here. We looked at some graphs last week in the Records of Management Strategy document, and there's a set of them on page 170. I'm not sure what exhibit number this is.
Exhibit 330.
And on page 170, just because I'm sure if I said, remember those graphs that we talked about last week, you might have a hard time recalling which ones I'm referring to. So these are the graphs that are used to display the daily abundance pattern of the different stocks. And in this case, they're shown relative to the forecast, 2 levels of forecast, the median value and the lower value referred to as the 75p here. So the way that the Mission estimates are used is they're actually used to create that dark sort of jaggedy line, which in the top there for early Stewart shows a little bit of a peak around the 29th of July, for example. That's the graph that I'm referring to. So the Mission data are used to generate that daily abundance pattern along with any catches. So last week we talked about this idea of a sort of a boxcar model with this train car that's about a day wide that has an abundance of fish on it. And if there's no fishing, then as that abundance passes the test fisheries and it reaches Mission, then those two numbers, if everything's working well, should be fairly similar in terms of their estimates. But if there's a fishery that occurs between the two sites, then there would be a removal. So obviously you want to account for the total abundance. So these graphs are intended to be the total abundance, not just escapement. So it's the Mission data, which is the primary anchor. Any catches that might have occurred between test fisheries and Mission that need to be added to the total run. that's the primary tool that's used to generate these graphs. The last 6 days, because those are fish that would pass the test fishery but not yet reach mission, would be test fishing based. So it would be nice to be able to kind of color in the last 6 days of these graphs. But in the case of early Stewart, by this date, I'm not sure what the date is, it looks like it's sometime in late July, all of the fish that would have been available to pass mission would have passed. But in the case of early summers and summers, you see you're at different stages of the run. So the concept is that you take these in-season daily reconstructions, what we call them, these bold, solid lines, and compare them to hypothetical run sizes with different timing and spread. And you're trying to ask the question, not just the forecast, but a whole range of them. And you're trying to ask, okay, which possible scenario of abundance and timing is most consistent with the data? And in our discussion last week, we talked about how you're more certain about that when you see the peak. So this is a very good example. You see the early Stewart, if you've got the entire run in your sights, you could be pretty sure about finding some limited set of potential abundances that would be consistent with that. If you look at the summer run on the bottom, clearly there's going to be a whole range of potential abundances and timings that will be equally consistent with that little bit of data that we have. So mission is the kind of the anchor for generating these curves.
And why use mission and not just the test fishing data that you're receiving 6 days prior to mission?
Well, the main issue is something I think I also referred to last week, is that mission is quite a large sample. We probably actually in physical targets detect at mission somewhere in the order of 10 to 15% of the actual number of fish going by. Test fishing catches represent somewhere on the order of half a percent to 1%. So it's a much smaller sample. So the mission data should be more precise and we believe more accurate, just because it's a larger sample of what's going by.
Right, and near the mission hydroacoustic site, there are places where you you collect samples for stock composition.
Yeah, so the idea there is that the total sockeye number comes from the combination of the acoustics and any species composition. So in pink ears, you'd have to parse out the pinks from the sockeye. But then you want to divide that total sockeye into the different stock groups at a minimum, the 4 managed sockeye management groups, so the early Stewart, early summer, summer, and lates. But then, as I think some of these other graphs in this document show, sometimes we're parsing out into finer units for different purposes. So, it's the concept that you've got the total pie, which is the sockeye, and then the stock ID is splitting that pie into the different component groups.
Are the programs, is the mission program, I should say, reviewed by the PSA staff every year?
Yep, it's a routine part of our postseason work.
Okay. And who's part of that review? Which is it, all PSC or are other people involved?
We have both internal and collaborative reviews. The internal reviews are, just our staff. The external or the collaborative reviews involve a group called the Hydroacoustics Working Group, which is largely comprised of colleagues from DFO who have considerable acoustics expertise. So that kind of was born out of more formal collaborations as a result of some of these reviews that have occurred in the past, where there's been recommendations for improvements. And so we're sort of kept that group together, and we try to take advantage of their views in reviewing our programs.
Right, I'm going to show you a document which is in tab 4 of the binder you have in front of you. It's CAN 065011.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you. And these are minutes of a hydroacoustic working group, HOG.
Right.
This is the group you were just talking about.
Yeah, it's a catchy name, so it works. Yeah, this is our group, and it varies. Like sometimes there'll be some other folks than the ones listed on this list, but those are the principal players in the group.
Right, and this is an example of the minutes that would be kept in of that kind of a meeting, obviously.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it's a perfect, good example.
All right. You said that this working group was put together following some reviews. Is this? Can you relate to the year of those reviews to the creation of this group?
Sure. So we've had reviews associated with 1992, which was Pierce Larkin review. 1994, John Fraser review. 1998 was an internal review, largely within the Fraser panel, in reference to the very hot water we had in the Fraser River that year. 2004, Brian Williams review. Trying to think if I've missed any. I think those are most of them, and of course, standing committee, Brian.
2004.
Okay, so there was a standing committee review also in 2004, I believe.
Okay. And was this group created in reaction to all of those? I mean, I would
Oh, no,
think
actually,
so,
this
no.
group is there all the way through, so there's nothing about the 2004 review that was unique relative to the past years, except that obviously we had a lot more outside folks focused on what we're doing. But other than that, it's a routine thing. We meet, whether we have a review or not, we meet.
All right. In 2004, you met with, I think this was following the Williams review, if that's
Well, I think the Williams review was still meeting in the spring of that year, as I recall, but I could be wrong. I seem to recall testifying in like April, May of that year. So this was prior to that, probably to lay out some work plans for input into that process.
All right. And the Williams review was instigated by some significant discrepancies, amongst other things, in 2004. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. And discrepancies in the river portion in terms of what got on the spawning ground and what was recorded.
Yeah, this item that we've been calling the DBE in my previous testimony is the topic of that review largely.
All right. And is that what was on the table for discussion during the working group meeting that I have put in?
It's on the table for discussion in every year. So one of the inferences we draw, or one of the things we use to draw an inference about how we're doing is how well or not the upstream numbers coincide with what we might have expected based on our lower river hydroacoustics.
All right. Could I have these minutes marked, please?
Exhibit number 353.
Okay. So this issue that's on the table, the bias or accuracy admission, can you describe what that issue is and how it was addressed in your working group?
I'm trying to think of a specific recollection to 2004. We would have done our normal routine review of the sampling schemes to see if there were any issues with equipment, unsampled areas, anything that we could think of that would be obvious from a sampling design perspective that could cause bias. In 2004, we probably looked for other sources of causes for discrepancies. The big one in 2004 would have been the extremely warm temperatures. I think my recollection serves me right. I think there were something like 8 or 9 record daily maximums Fraser River temperatures set in that year. In other words, the warmest day temperature on this date in 60 years. There were like 9 of those set in 2004. So in a general sense, though, this program has been subject to fairly intense scrutiny over time, and in all of those reviews, including 2004, and in general, it's been not found that there's significant issues, although we've always come out of those reviews with recommendations for improvements. Having said that, accuracy is not that easy to address in a scientific sense. And the reason I say that is when you use a word like accuracy, and there's quite a bit of misunderstanding, not only in the public, but also in some technical discussions, what you're really saying is how close is your estimate to what the true underlying population is. And the reality is, at Mission, we don't know what the true underlying population is. And so the way we try to address the issue of accuracy is by drawing some sort of an inference. And you draw an inference from a number of different ways. One is to, again, look at your sampling design. Are there any elements of your sampling design, places you're not sampling, things like that could create some sort of bias? But the other way that's been used, and more commonly, is to compare the Mission estimate to another estimate from somewhere else, like Quaylark or upstream, and that is used to draw an inference. And I guess it's always important as a scientist to sort of think about that and recognize that if that's another estimate, then that estimate could also not represent the true value. So you're caught in this dilemma of trying to look for some consistency in independent estimates and say, well, if they're inconsistent, there's definitely something that could be wrong with one of them. If they're consistent, perhaps the impression is drawn that perhaps they're correct, which may be true. I mean, it's probably both the likelihood of two independent things being wrong. So it's a real challenge at the mission site and any other acoustic site to know what the true answer is, and so we're always trying to draw these indirect inferences based on either other estimates or looking at our program to see if there's anything faulty about the way we're sampling that could create a problem.
You talked about evaluating the sampling design as being one thing to be done.
Yeah, and you could think about other ways in sort of an academic sense to do this. I'm not necessarily recommending them, but so for example, when there's a large fishery in Area E, it tends to remove almost all the fish that are available on a daily block. So when we see a mission estimate following a fishery that is a very low number, that gives us some confirmation that when there's a removal, we've got a pretty good handle on the estimate. You could do the reverse experiment and get a daily abundance estimate at mission and then try to remove fish upstream of it to try to get a sample of a day's migration. I mean, these are things that could be done, but it is very challenging. But we do use catch information both above and below mission to give us an idea, okay, well, does that catch make sense relative to the number of fish that were available or the harvest rates that a fishery could exert. So it's definitely kind of inferential, indirect, not really attacking the accuracy question in a pure scientific sense.
Right, so the issue about bias has been on the table for a number of years, and it is something that you review every year?
Yes, it's a routine part of our analysis in the postseason.
All right, and have any improvements been made over the last, say, 5 to 10 years in addressing some of these concerns?
Yeah, a number of them. The most notables would be moving to the split beam technology from the single beam technology. Single beam technology is not capable of discerning direction of travel or speed of travel, where a split beam is. So we had, I guess, initiated from the 1994 review about a 7-8 year program to bring those methods of split beam technology to mission. And so that was one of the main ones. Another main one is to try to sample also from the shore. So we basically followed a model developed for quailark when quailark was first developed in its first incarnation, I guess, in the mid-90s, to say, okay, if we can sample from the shore a significant fraction of the abundance, that should be much more robust. And the reason it's more robust is that when you have a boat that's moving, a couple of things happen. One is fish do react to a boat. I'm sure everyone can relate to the idea that if you have a boat with a motor on it and you're trying to sample fish, they're going to react to the motor. And we can detect evidence of this within about 4 meters of our boat. We've done some work on that. The other one is that you're trying to get an estimate of the speed of travel, which is important for the estimation. And so if you have a moving vessel and moving fish, it can be really difficult to get an accurate estimate of the speed. So the reason to go to the shore-based system is you can get way more accurate estimates of speed of travel and direction travel from the shore. So split beam, trying to sample from the shore, we have systems now on both banks, are two of the most significant improvements we've made in the last 4 or 5 years.
Thank you. And Dr. Riddell, do you have anything to add on this? And you need to turn your mic on. Thank you.
Well, there's a couple points. I want to support what Mike was saying about how you assess accuracy or bias in that. And really the only way you can evaluate that is with an independent estimate. And Mike stressed the consistency element. But we also have to recognize each has independent sources of bias. You tend to be using a different tool or you're using a different location and that. So we do place a fairly high dependence on consistency between estimates and that. And we do look for, if it's a 3-day lag between mission and getting up to quailark, if we adjust for that, is there a strong correlation? And many of your documents you'll see have plots of returns over time overlapped, and there's a very, very high correspondence. And that, so it's a difficult thing to do. I think, as Mike just said, the Pacific Salmon Commission has made a very serious effort to work with other groups and improve their estimates over time. And as we'll get to later, I guess the main emphasis for going to quailark in the late 2000s was really to try and tie down this issue of accuracy of the estimate and whether we can account for some of the repeated sort of differences in numbers that people talk about.
And one other problem that's been identified at mission is the impact of pinks co-migrating with sockeye. Can you give us some information on that?
Sure, that's correct. And we've already touched on this a few times, I guess, even when I think the first time I was here, perhaps in October or November. But there's two components of this. The most important one to focus on is the sampling of the species that are migrating by, and we use test fisheries to obtain the sample. And what we've noticed with pink salmon, and it became very obvious in 2005, where we feel like we probably had fairly significant bias in mission during our in-season period, is that the test fishery that we use, and I'm speaking specifically about the Wannock test fishery now, tends to catch a disproportionate number of sockeye relative to the overall migration of sockeye plus pink. Likely that's due to differences in where these fish travel. Pinks tend to be quite near shore, sockeye more in the mid-channel areas, and this test fishery at Wannock is more of a mid-channel sampling test fishery. There's a second component that's not discussed too much, but we may get into a little bit more when we talk about other tools, is that the pink salmon, because they are shore-oriented and they can be quite abundant, something like 15, 20 million runs are not uncommon, of which a fairly significant fraction of that would end up in the Fraser River. They can, with a split beam technology, really swamp the technology in some ways, almost overwhelm the ability to discern individual targets. If you're looking at a signal from this kind of equipment, it would almost look like a complete black screen in some cases when the pinks are very abundant. So that means that there would be a tendency to have a low bias in the total salmon because the pinks would not be estimated that accurately, but a high bias in the proportion of sockeye. The high bias in the proportion of sockeye is what created the problem in 2005. And 2005 was an extreme case because of the extraordinary lateness of the sockeye run and also the early upstream migration of pinks. They seem to be doing something similar to late run sockeye. So it's the combination of the sampling, which you want to be representative of the overall migration that comes from the test fishery, and the acoustic challenges that pinks pose that give us a challenge on pink years, let's say.
And that problem you described as being particularly bad in 2005?
Yes, it was extraordinarily bad for the reasons I just described in terms of the overlap in the two species.
And in 2007, did it continue to be a problem?
In 2007 and 2009, we managed to kind of finesse a solution that we have used historically to estimate the sockeye, and that is to use the test fishery. Prior to 2005 and continuing since then, as I said, 2007, 2009, what we've used is related the catch of sockeye in the test fishery to the abundance of sockeye at mission prior to when the pinks show up. So to get that ratio of how many fish are associated with a particular size catch, how many fish in the total migration, how many sockeye. And that was used very successfully, and then up until 2005, when there really wasn't a good, strong period of abundant sockeye migration before the pinks showed up, that they basically showed up at the same time, so we couldn't use that method in 2005. But in 2007, 2009, we did use that method, and it seems to have come out okay. I guess I would just say, because people will know, especially about 2009, is that those are both two very low sockeye run years, very low, 1.5 million. I think 2007 was in the same range. And so in that situation, you're not likely to oversample the sockeye with a test fishery in the middle of the channel because there aren't many to begin with. So I wouldn't suggest that the fact that we were able to finesse the method and use the historical approach in 2007, 2009 is kind of like we've got it solved. I think it just happened to work out because there was a low abundance of sockeye. So we're looking at other ways around this issue, and we can maybe talk about those a little bit later if we get into that issue.
Could I just add something to that? I think just for clarification, what Mike is really talking about is you have annual variation because of the Fraser sockeye abundance is in the cycles. And that now 2009 was very exceptionally low, and that was different from the expected cycle year, but 2008 was not, and that was a low cycle year. And the major difference that really caused a lot of problems in recent years has been the earlier run timing of pink that then overlapped with the later run, or the late portion of the summer sockeye and the beginning of, right through the fall sockeye.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That's
the
great.
late run. So you've got really two factors that the commission really has to sort out. One is the abundance of sockeye that has a couple of reasons between years, and the other is the recently abnormal run timing of pink salmon. And now we could be looking at just enormous runs, like '09 and expected for 2011 should be very big again.
Right, and have there been any solutions worked out for what's expected in 2011?
Well, I've received a forecast document in my email today, and it was received under the agreement of confidentiality because it's subject to review at the PSARC meeting on February 4th. So I'm not sure what the protocol is for divulging that at this particular forum, but I have seen a number. But the reason that Brian is suggesting it would be large is that there is a number out there that's the juvenile outmigration estimate from 2010, and it was somewhere in the order of 1 billion fry, which was not double the previous largest, but it was, I think the previous largest was 600 million. So
Is this pinks you're talking
we're
about?
talking about pinks. Sorry, thank you. Yes, we're talking about pink salmon. So Brian's intuition about the potential for large forecasts comes from that very large outmigration of the juveniles.
All right, so are you anticipating a problem then with the species composition issue at Mission this
We
year?
anticipate having to address the problem again this year, and we're trying to put some programs in place. And I think that's what you were starting to ask me, but I'm not sure to try to address it.
Yeah, so is Fish Wheels a project that is designed to address species composition?
It wasn't specifically designed as that as its sole purpose, but it is an option. And so,
How does that work?
well, the issue is the solution to this, in terms of a conceptual solution, is quite obvious. And what it's going to involve is what we call a stratified sampling approach. And what I mean by that is it's since we understand from our test fisheries that the sockeye and the pinks are not distributed evenly across the river, then it makes sense to have samples of the species composition from the shore separate from the channel. So that's the idea of a stratified sample, talking about stratified in space across the river channel. And similarly match that up with stratified samples of the acoustics from our acoustic estimation. Now, it just so happens that our acoustic estimation has already got a built-in stratification. We have a system on each shore and a system in the channel. So that part is well looked after. The challenge is to come up with a stratified sampling of the species composition, of which the fish wheel provided an option for the shore-based sampling of the species composition. So the approaches that we've talked about, and in fact even implemented as a pilot in '09, were to use the fish wheel as the shore-based sampler and Wannock as the channel sampler for species composition. And we actually developed an estimate of pink salmon escapement in 2009 based on that method, and it actually came out to a number that, well, it was about 15 million pink salmon, which happened to match up with the run size estimate from the test fishing less the catch. So because they agree, of course, we believe they're probably both right, but that may not be true. And the other method that we're talking about, and we have already tried, although we haven't had the test fishery operate for a long enough period yet, is to use a test fishery at the mission site itself. We've engaged Sumas First Nation to use set nets near the shore for the shore-based part of the species composition, and then a drift gill net upstream of mission for the channel. So those are the two kind of ideas we have for the species composition and stratified sampling.
I have a note here about near-shore estimates using DITSN. Is that the system that you already described when you said you have a system on the shore and a system in the
No, that relates to the second part of the pink salmon challenge that we have, this issue of saturating the split beam. It turns out that DITSN seems to be quite robust, quite a bit more robust in terms of the volume of fish that can be passing the DITSN without creating a problem with the estimation. And we know this from our work at Mission. We also know from the work at Quailark, which has had a DITSN in the last 3 years, that the daily abundances, I won't be able to remember the maximum daily abundance off the top of my head, but closer to 1 million fish per day seem to be able to go past these systems. And remember, they're going to be split in two because there's one on each bank. Seem to be able to be handled. I mean, it's tiring for the folks that are doing the estimation because they're actually physically clicking through some of these counts. But it looks from a technology perspective, that's a real advantage that the DITSN, among others, that will offer us in solving this problem.
Okay. Is it fair to say that where we sit today, that Mission doesn't provide a reasonable assessment of sockeye when pink salmon are there? I mean, it doesn't sound like the problem's been completely solved.
I mean, I think it's sort of a yes and no answer. There are certain conditions, and Brian was helpful in bringing these up, related to the relative abundance of sockeye and pinks, when it's going to be more of a challenge, and when the pinks come in early, where it's going to be more of a challenge than others. But we have 3 years, just take the most recent 3 years. 2005, clearly very significant problem in Mission. Documented in our annual report, already come up in evidence already. We've talked about it. 2007, 2009, seems like we did reasonably okay. So it's fair to say that the problem definitely has not been solved. I think but can we say every year it will be a problem? It will depend upon what the fish do to us, I guess.
And what about you, Dr. Riddell? Do you agree that although there are some problems, we can still get reasonable estimates of sockeye at Mission when pink salmon are in the water?
Well, I think that Mike referred to the fish wheels as not really being one of the target benefits of doing that, but there are a number of spin-offs from the quail arc program linked with the fish wheels and that. And I think that by actually investigating all the data that we have at the same time, that the Commission has certainly found ways that, as Mike said, stratify the river, use other tools to get your best estimate in particular strata, and then put that back together. We've only been able to really do that because we've had other people working with the Commission now using new tools and trying to verify some of these things. So I think we'll be able to build on that, and we'll be able to do a better job because the tools that we have looked at, particularly in postseason, really did fit quite well for 2007 and 2009.
All right, and just one last question on this pinks, and then I think we'll stop for the day. What are we've of course heard many times about the 4 run timing groups in the sockeye system. Which of those run timing groups are impacted by the co-migration of pinks?
Primarily up until the pinks started coming in early, it was the late run, but now certainly the summer run and the late run for sure, and in some years, if it's a very large pink run and they're very early, the back half of the early summer can also be impacted by this problem. The later time part of the early summers, I should say.
So on pink years, it's a very significant portion of the sockeye
run
that's impacted.
If the pinks migrate upstream early, it can impact almost all the run groups except for early steward.
Okay. If it's convenient, I'll stop there for today.
Thank you. Hearing is now adjourned for the day, and we'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.